They were told Americans would burn them alive, rape them, then feed their bodies to dogs. That's what the Japanese military told every woman on Saipan in the summer of 1944. So when Keiko collapsed on the dirt road, unable to move her legs, her friends prepared to die with her. They had been walking for 3 days without food. Their bodies were covered in bruises from Japanese soldiers, who beat them for dishonoring the emperor by surrendering. But when the American medics saw Keiko's twisted legs and heard her screams, they didn't laugh. They didn't walk away. Instead, they ran toward her. And that moment changed everything these women believed about their enemy. If you want to hear more incredible true stories from World War II, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. The road was nothing more than packed dirt, dusty and cracked under the brutal Pacific sun. It was August 1944, and the island of Saipan had just fallen to American forces after weeks of bloody fighting. Smoke still rose from distant hills where Japanese soldiers had made their last stands. The air smelled like burnt metal and something worse, death that lingered in the tropical heat. 15 Japanese women walked in a line along this road, their heads down, their movements slow and painful. They wore torn civilian clothes, simple cotton dresses that were now brown with dirt and stained with blood. Some were barefoot. Others wore wooden sandals that were falling apart. Their hair, once carefully arranged, now hung loose and tangled. Cuts covered their arms and legs. Bruises darkened their faces. At the front of the line walked 2 American soldiers with rifles. They looked young, maybe 20 years old, with sunburned faces and nervous eyes. They had been told to escort these Japanese civilian women to a collection point, where they would be processed as prisoners. Behind the women walked 2 more soldiers, keeping watch. The landscape around them told the story of the battle. Burned-out tanks sat in fields. Bomb craters filled with rainwater dotted the hillsides. Palm trees stood like broken skeletons, their tops blown off by artillery. In the distance, they could hear the sounds of bulldozers and trucks as American forces cleared the island and built new positions. The heat hit like a physical weight. It pressed down on the women's shoulders and made every breath feel thick and difficult. Sweat ran down their faces and backs, soaking through their already dirty clothes. The dust from the road rose with each step, coating their throats and making them cough. The smell was overwhelming. Rotting vegetation mixed with the sharp chemical smell of explosives. Smoke drifted across the road, making their eyes water. When the wind shifted, it brought the sweet, sickening smell of bodies decomposing in the jungle. The sounds were strange and frightening. American voices speaking English, harsh, foreign words they couldn't understand. The rumble of distant engines. The crack of occasional gunfire, as soldiers cleared caves where Japanese holdouts still hid. Birds that had survived the battle called out from the remaining trees, their voices almost mocking in their normalcy. Through all of this, the women walked in silence. Their wooden sandals scraped against the dirt. Their breathing came in short, painful gasps. Some of them cried quietly, tears making clean tracks down their dusty faces. Keiko had been walking in the middle of the group. She was 23 years old, a nurse who had been working at the Japanese military hospital when the Americans invaded. For 3 days since the surrender, she had been walking with barely any food or water. Her body was covered in bruises, not from American soldiers, but from Japanese officers who had beaten her and the other women for the crime of surrendering instead of killing themselves. The Japanese military had a phrase, death before dishonor. They had told all the women on Saipan that Americans were animals, that they would torture and kill any Japanese they captured. Many civilians had jumped from the cliffs rather than surrender. Keiko had watched families throw their children into the sea before jumping themselves. She had seen women clutch grenades to their chests, but Keiko and these 14 other women had been too exhausted, too broken to kill themselves. They had chosen to live, even if it meant facing whatever the Americans would do to them. And for that choice, their own people had beaten them mercilessly. Now, as she walked, Keiko felt something wrong in her legs. A deep, shooting pain that started in her lower back and spread down through her hips. With each step, the pain grew worse. She bit her lip to keep from crying out. She couldn't show weakness, not here, not in front of the enemy. But the pain became unbearable. It happened without warning. One moment, Keiko was walking. The next, her legs simply stopped working. The pain shot through her spine like electricity, and her knees buckled. She fell forward onto the dirt road, her hands barely breaking her fall. She screamed. She couldn't help it. The pain was too much. The line of women stopped immediately. The woman behind Keiko, her name was Yuki, dropped to her knees beside her friend. "Keiko, what's wrong? Can you stand?" Keiko tried to push herself up, but her legs wouldn't respond. It felt like they belonged to someone else, like they had been disconnected from her body. When she looked down, she could see them lying there on the road, but she couldn't feel them anymore. Only pain, only burning, terrible pain in her back. I can't move them," Keiko gasped. Tears streamed down her face. "My legs. I can't feel my legs." The American soldiers had stopped too. They stood a few feet away, looking confused and uncomfortable. One of them, a tall soldier with red hair, called out something in English. His voice sounded harsh to the women's ears, though his tone seemed more concerned than angry. The other women gathered around Keiko, forming a protective circle. They had all been taught that Americans were monsters. Now their friend was helpless on the ground. What would these soldiers do? Would they shoot her? Leave her to die? Beat her for slowing them down? One of the older women, Sachiko, who had worked as a teacher before the war, stood up and faced the American soldiers. She held up her hands in a gesture they might understand. "Please wait. Please help." She pointed at Keiko on the ground, then made a gesture like someone unable to walk. The red-haired soldier looked at his companion, then back at the women. He said something into a radio handset that hung from his shoulder. His voice was quick and urgent, but not angry. He kept looking at Keiko, at her twisted position on the ground, at the way the other women were trying to help her. Minutes passed. The women did their best to make Keiko comfortable. Yuki cradled her friend's head in her lap, wiping the dust from her face with the edge of her dress. Another woman tried to straighten Keiko's legs, but Keiko screamed in agony at even the slightest touch. "Don't move me," Keiko begged. "Please, it hurts too much." The women began to whisper among themselves. "What will they do to her?" one asked. "She can't walk." "Will they shoot her?" another worried. "Maybe they'll leave her here," a third suggested, her voice hollow with fear. They had all heard the stories. The Japanese military had told them again and again. Americans had no mercy. They would kill wounded prisoners. They would torture anyone who couldn't keep up. Better to die fighting or die by your own hand than fall into American custody. But they had already surrendered. They had already made the choice to live. Now they would see if that choice meant death after all. The sound of an engine approached. A military jeep came speeding down the road, its tires kicking up clouds of dust. It skidded to a stop about 20 feet away, and two men jumped out. The women tensed. This was it. Whatever was going to happen would happen now. But these weren't regular soldiers. They wore different uniforms with red crosses on white armbands. Medics. American medics. They carried bags over their shoulders and moved with practiced urgency. The first medic was young, maybe 25, with dark hair and a serious face. The second was older, with gray at his temples and glasses that reflected the sun. They walked quickly toward the group of women, and the Japanese prisoners instinctively moved back, still forming a protective circle around Keiko. The young medic held up his hands in a peaceful gesture. He said something in English, his voice calm and steady. The tone was gentle, reassuring. He pointed at Keiko, then at his medical bag, then made a gesture of examining someone. Sachiko, the former teacher, understood. He wanted to look at Keiko, to help her, or to decide if she was worth saving. The women looked at each other, silently communicating. They had no choice. If they refused, the soldiers might force them anyway. Slowly they parted, allowing the medics to approach. The young medic knelt beside Keiko on the dusty road. He set his bag down and opened it, revealing bandages, bottles, instruments. He looked at Keiko's face, at her tears, and his expression softened. He said something in English, his voice quiet and gentle. The tone was unmistakable. "I'm here to help." Then he did something that shocked every woman there. He smiled. Not a cruel smile or a mocking smile. A kind smile. The kind you give to someone who is suffering, to tell them they're not alone. Keiko stared at him through her tears, confused and frightened. This wasn't what she expected. This wasn't the monster she had been told about. The medic began his examination. His hands moved carefully, professionally. He checked Keiko's pulse at her wrist, then at her neck. He looked into her eyes with a small flashlight. He asked questions in English, and though Keiko couldn't understand the words, she understood he was asking where it hurt. "My back," she managed to say in Japanese, pointing. "My legs. I can't feel them." The medic's face became more serious. He spoke to his partner in rapid English, then began carefully examining Keiko's spine and legs. His touch was gentle, but even the slightest pressure made Keiko cry out in pain. The older medic joined him, and together they had a quick, intense conversation. They kept using medical terms, words that meant nothing to the watching women, but their faces told a story. This was serious, very serious. The young medic looked up at the group of women, then at the soldiers who had been escorting them. He spoke firmly, giving what sounded like orders. The red-haired soldier nodded and spoke into his radio again. Then the medic turned back to Keiko. He opened his bag and pulled out a small bottle and a syringe. The watching women gasped. What was that? Poison? Something to kill her quickly? But Sachiko, who had seen some medical training before the war, recognized it. Morphine. Pain medicine. Strong pain medicine. The medic showed the syringe to Keiko, then pointed at her arm. He made an injection gesture, then a sleeping gesture, trying to communicate. "This will help with the pain. This will make you feel better." Keiko looked at Yuki, who still held her head. Yuki nodded, tears in her eyes. What choice did they have? Keiko held out her arm. Within minutes of the injection, Keiko's face began to relax. The morphine was working, dulling the terrible pain that had consumed her. Her breathing became slower, steadier. For the first time in hours, she wasn't crying. The young medic stayed beside her, monitoring her condition. He checked her pulse regularly, looked at her eyes, spoke to her in his gentle English, even though she couldn't understand. The tone was what mattered. The tone said, "You're going to be okay. We're taking care of you." Another vehicle arrived, this time a larger truck with a canvas cover and a red cross painted on its side. An ambulance. The back opened, and 2 more medics climbed out with a stretcher. This was the moment that truly shocked the Japanese women. The medics didn't simply throw Keiko onto the stretcher. They didn't drag her or handle her roughly. Instead, they worked with incredible care. The older medic explained something to the younger ones, making gestures about Keiko's spine, about being careful. They positioned the stretcher beside her on the ground. Then, working together, they carefully rolled Keiko onto her side, supporting her head and keeping her spine straight. They slid a board under her back, something to keep her stable, then gently rolled her onto the stretcher. The whole process took several minutes. The medics moved slowly, deliberately, checking constantly to make sure they weren't causing more damage. When Keiko cried out despite the morphine, they stopped and waited until the pain passed before continuing. The watching women couldn't believe what they were seeing. These were the same Americans they had been told were savages, the same enemy who supposedly showed no mercy. Yet here they were, treating Keiko with more care and gentleness than the women had seen in months. Once Keiko was secured on the stretcher, the medics lifted her carefully and carried her to the ambulance. They placed the stretcher on a special rack inside, securing it so it wouldn't slide or tip. The young medic climbed in beside her, still monitoring her condition. Before they closed the ambulance doors, the medic looked out at the group of women. He pointed at them, then at himself, then made a gesture of following. He was telling them, "You're coming too. You'll be with your friend." The red-haired soldier who had been escorting them spoke to another soldier who had arrived with the ambulance. There was a brief discussion. Then the soldier waved at the women, gesturing for them to climb into the back of a regular transport truck that had pulled up behind the ambulance. The women looked at each other, uncertain. Was this real? Were they really going to be allowed to stay with Keiko? Or was this a trick? Sachiko made the decision. She walked toward the truck and climbed in. One by one, the others followed. They sat on the hard wooden benches that lined the sides of the truck bed, holding onto the canvas sides as the engine started. As the small convoy began to move, ambulance first, then the truck with the women, then a jeep with soldiers following behind, the women sat in stunned silence. They could see the ambulance ahead of them through the open back of their truck. They could see the red cross painted on its rear door. Yuki wiped tears from her eyes. "They're helping her," she whispered. "The Americans. They're actually helping her." Another woman, Michiko, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. Her voice was small and confused. "But they told us. They said Americans would kill us, that they were demons." No one had an answer. They just held onto the truck as it bounced down the rough road, watching the ambulance ahead of them, trying to understand what was happening to everything they thought they knew. The convoy drove for about 20 minutes, leaving behind the destroyed battlefields and entering an area where the Americans had already established their presence. The women stared out the back of the truck at a world that seemed impossible. The road became smoother, recently repaired by American engineers. They passed warehouses made of metal that gleamed in the sun, structures that had been erected in just days. They saw stacks of supplies taller than houses, crates, barrels, boxes marked with English words. Trucks moved everywhere, carrying materials, soldiers, equipment. The scale of American resources was staggering. The convoy turned into a large compound surrounded by a fence. A sign at the gate had English words the women couldn't read. Field Hospital 31st Medical Battalion. Guards waved them through. Inside, the compound was organized chaos. Wounded American soldiers were being carried on stretchers from ambulances to large tents. Doctors and nurses moved quickly between the tents, shouting orders. The American flag hung from a tall pole in the center of the compound, snapping in the breeze. The ambulance carrying Keiko pulled up to a large tent marked with a red cross. Medics rushed out to meet it. The truck with the Japanese women stopped nearby, and a soldier gestured for them to get out. The women climbed down carefully, staying close together. American soldiers and medical personnel moved around them, but no one paid them much attention. Everyone was too busy. The field hospital was treating casualties from the battle for Saipan, and there were many wounded men who needed care. A female American nurse approached them. She was young, maybe 30, with brown hair pulled back under her nurse's cap. Her uniform was clean and white, though it had bloodstains on the sleeves. She looked tired, like she hadn't slept in days, but her face was kind. She spoke to them in English, her voice warm and professional. When it became clear they didn't understand, she made gestures. She pointed at the women, then at a smaller tent nearby, then made a sitting motion. She wanted them to wait there. Sachiko nodded, understanding. The women followed the nurse to the tent. Inside, it was set up with wooden benches and a few cots. It was cooler in the shade, and after the long walk in the sun, the relief was immediate. The nurse brought them water, real, clean water in metal canteens. The women drank carefully at first, still not quite believing this was real. The water was cool and pure, better than anything they had tasted in weeks. Then the nurse brought food. She carried a box filled with cans and packages. She opened them to show the women. Canned meat, crackers, chocolate, bars, canned fruit. She set everything out on a wooden crate, then gestured for them to eat. The women stared at the food. It was more than they had seen in a month, more than some had seen in a year. During the final months of the war on Saipan, food had become scarce, even for military personnel. As civilians and nurses, these women had been eating rice mixed with dirt and whatever they could forage from the jungle. Yuki was the first to reach for something, a cracker. She bit into it carefully, her eyes widening. It was real. It was actual food, not rotten, not moldy, not mixed with sawdust. The others followed. They ate slowly, carefully, as if the food might disappear if they moved too fast. Some cried as they ate. The taste of real food, the feeling of a stomach beginning to fill. It was overwhelming. The American nurse watched them with a sad smile. She said something in English. her tone sympathetic. She didn't need to translate. Her expression said, "I'm sorry you were so hungry. I'm sorry this happened to you." Then she left, returning to her duties with the wounded soldiers. The women sat in the tent, eating and trying to process everything that was happening. Through the open tent flap, they could see the ambulance that had brought Keiko. Medics were rushing her stretcher into the large medical tent. Even from here, they could hear the urgency in the voices, see the speed at which the medical team moved. Michiko spoke quietly. "Do you think she'll survive?" No one answered. They didn't know, but for the first time, they had hope. Hours passed. The women sat in their tent, listening to the sounds of the field hospital around them. They heard ambulances arriving with more wounded. They heard the urgent voices of doctors calling for equipment, for blood, for assistance. They heard the groans of injured soldiers, the quick footsteps of nurses running between tents. A different nurse came to check on them around midday. She was older, with gray hair and a stern face that softened when she saw them. She brought more food, this time hot soup and bread. Real bread, soft and white. Not the hard military biscuits they had eaten that morning. The soup was chicken broth with vegetables and noodles. Steam rose from the metal bowls the nurse handed to each woman. The smell alone made their mouths water. When they tasted it, several women cried. It had been so long since they'd had hot food. So long since someone had given them something warm and nourishing. The older nurse sat with them for a few minutes, even though she was clearly busy. She spoke in English, her voice gentle, as if her tone alone could communicate what her words could not. She pointed at each woman, then made a writing gesture. She wanted to know their names. Sachiko understood. She spoke her name clearly. Sachiko. The nurse repeated it, getting the pronunciation close. Then she pointed at herself and said, "Lieutenant Anderson." She went around to each woman, learning their names, treating them like people rather than just enemy prisoners. When Lieutenant Anderson finished, she stood to leave, but Yuki grabbed her sleeve gently. "Keiko?" she asked, pointing toward the medical tent. "Our friend, Keiko." Lieutenant Anderson's face became serious. She made a gesture like someone lying down, then pointed at the medical tent, then made a cutting motion. Surgery. Keiko was in surgery. She held up her hands, showing 10 fingers, then made a waiting gesture. She would check on Keiko and come back to tell them. True to her word, Lieutenant Anderson returned about an hour later. Her expression was tired, but not sad. She sat down with the women again and tried to explain through gestures and simple words. She pointed at Keiko's imaginary spine, then made a gesture of something pressing down, compression. She showed how the doctors had to operate, had to fix the damage. Her hands moved in careful, precise motions, demonstrating the surgery. Then she made a hopeful face, a thumbs-up gesture. The surgery had gone well. The women clutched each other, relief flooding through them. Yuki buried her face in her hands and sobbed. Others hugged each other. Keiko was alive. She had survived. 3 days passed. The women were moved to a different part of the compound, a section set up for civilian prisoners. It wasn't luxurious, but it was clean and organized. They slept on cots with actual mattresses and blankets. They were given 3 meals a day, every day at regular times. The food kept coming, reliable and abundant. They were also given clean clothes, simple cotton dresses in various sizes, underwear, sandals that fit properly. They were allowed to shower in a facility with hot water and real soap. The soap smelled like flowers, nothing like the harsh military soap they had used before. Some of the women stood under the hot water for a long time, letting it wash away weeks of dirt, blood, and fear. On the 4th day, Lieutenant Anderson came to their tent with news. Keiko could have visitors. Yuki and Sachiko went with the nurse to the recovery tent. It was quieter here, with patients who were past the critical stage. Keiko lay in a bed, an actual bed with clean white sheets. Her head rested on a pillow. She was awake, though she looked pale and exhausted. When she saw her friends, tears filled her eyes. "You're here," she whispered in Japanese. "You're really here." Yuki rushed to her side, taking her hand carefully. "We're here. We're all safe. How do you feel?" "Tired," Keiko admitted. Confused. They fixed my back. The American doctors. They did surgery on my spine. She looked down at her legs under the thin blanket. I can feel them again. I can wiggle my toes. Sachiko felt tears on her own cheeks. That's wonderful, Keiko. That's incredible. Keiko looked around the recovery tent. Other patients lay in nearby beds. All Americans, all soldiers wounded in the battle for Saipan. Some were sleeping. Others were being tended by nurses. One was reading a magazine. Another was writing a letter home. They're treating me the same as them, Keiko said, her voice full of wonder. The same medicine, the same care. I don't understand. We're the enemy. We're Japanese. Why would they save me? It was the question all of them had been asking. Why this kindness? Why this care? They had been taught that Americans were barbaric, that they valued Japanese lives as less than human. Everything they were experiencing contradicted that teaching. Maybe, Sachiko said slowly, maybe everything we were told was a lie. The days turned into weeks. The women remained at the field hospital compound, now classified as civilian detainees rather than prisoners of war. They were given light work, helping in the kitchen, washing linens, organizing supplies. The work was easy, nothing like the hard labor they had expected as prisoners. But the real struggle wasn't physical. It was in their minds, in their hearts. One evening, about a month into their captivity, the women gathered in their tent for a difficult conversation. They had been dancing around the truth for weeks, but now it needed to be said aloud. 2 months into their captivity, something happened that crystallized the transformation for many of the women. A new group of American soldiers arrived at the field hospital, men who had been wounded in combat against Japanese forces. The turning point came in late October, 3 months after the women had been captured. Keiko had recovered enough to walk again, though she still moved carefully and used a cane. The American doctors were amazed at her progress. They had saved her ability to walk, and she had worked hard in physical therapy to regain her strength. November brought news that the women had been both hoping for and dreading. Plans were being made for repatriation. As the war continued and American forces advanced closer to Japan itself, arrangements were being made through neutral countries to return civilian prisoners. The journey home was long and complicated, involving multiple ships and processing centers. The women were eventually put on a neutral Swedish ship that sailed to Yokohama, Japan's main port near Tokyo. The war ended in August 1945 with Japan's surrender. The years that followed were chaotic: occupation, reconstruction, transformation. The 15 women, scattered across a devastated Japan, tried to rebuild their lives. And so that dusty road where Keiko collapsed became more than just a road. It became the place where 15 Japanese women learned that the enemy they had been taught to fear was more human than the leaders they had been taught to trust. The morphine injection, the careful surgery, the hot meals, the clean beds, these weren't just acts of military protocol. They were demonstrations of a different kind of power, the power of compassion over cruelty, of mercy over hatred, of choosing humanity even in the midst of war. For those 15 women, the memory of that American medical camp never faded. It remained with them through the hard years of reconstruction, through the stigma and the struggle, through the slow transformation of Japan from militaristic empire to peaceful democracy. They carried with them a truth that their government had tried to hide, that the Americans they had been taught to call demons had shown them more kindness than their own military had, that the enemy had valued their lives when their own nation had told them to die. As Keiko wrote in her diary, which she kept for the rest of her life, "They saved my spine, but they broke something else. The lies that had held us captive far more than any prison fence. And in breaking those lies, they freed us to see the truth." Decades later, when Keiko was an old woman, she would tell her grandchildren about that day on the road, about the collapse, about the American medics who ran toward her instead of away from her. "Remember," she would tell them, "hatred is taught, compassion is a choice, and sometimes the most powerful weapon is not a gun or a bomb, but simple human decency." That is the story worth remembering. If you found this story meaningful and want to hear more incredible true stories from World War II, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. These stories, though buried in time, still speak to us today about the choices we make between hatred and compassion, between believing lies and seeking truth. Thank you for watching.